we should look into quality of qualitative data. The way you think about quality of qualitative data is a bit different because the research process is more holistic and more integrated. So data collection itself is more intricately interwoven with the analysis of the data and the conclusions you draw based on the data. So it's not so easy to single out the measurement part or the data collection part and assess that quality in isolation. You rather have a comprehensive evaluation of data quality and the adequacy of conclusions and generalizations one can draw based on them. So it's usually not focused on the measurement instrument alone and not the measurement process alone, but rather look at the more holistic part. And researcher interpretations thereby also become part of the assessment of data quality. And since the classical quality criteria from quantitative research are derived from the natural sciences and the positivist logic, they can't simply be applied to qualitative data as well. But there have been attempts to parallelize qualitative criteria or translate these quantitative criteria into the language and application area of qualitative data. So you can think of validity as well. Here it means something else, however. Does the interpretation the researcher arrives at reflect the empirical reality? So this is relatively close to the quantitative logic, but the way what this practically means is something different. So if not, it's a problem of research design. That's one possibility. Selection of cases. Are they not sufficiently informative regarding the research objectives? Or is it a problem of data collection? We have a suboptimal interview guide or observation schedule. Is it because of the recording, our note-taking or transcription has deficiencies? Is it because of our analysis, suboptimal analysis procedure, or suboptimal execution thereof? Or is it a problem of our interpretation if all the other steps have been accurate enough? So it's many more different components that need to be viewed to assess the validity of qualitative research or conclusions based on qualitative data. And in parallel, we also have reliability in a qualitative sense. And here we need to abstract a bit from the quantitative meaning. So here the question is not whether we get exactly the same responses if we repeat the analysis or the study a second time, because it's much too unstandardized to expect that to happen, and that would in fact cast severe doubts on the authenticity of the data. Rather, we would go towards the conclusions and say, how likely is it that the same or other groups of researchers would arrive at similar theoretical or conceptual conclusions if they repeated the study under similar circumstances and in a similar setting? So would they propose the same conceptual refinements? Would they observe similar kinds of patterns and emphasize the same kinds of patterns? So are the conclusions from the study volatile? Then that's a problem. Or can we rely on them? Are they reliable? Would they show up again? So this is maybe even a bit closer to replicability in the quantitative tradition than to reliability of a measurement instrument. And finally, we have the question of generalizability in a qualitative sense. In a quantitative context, that is something entirely different than that is not just based on the measurement instrument. So in quantitative research, generalizability is also a question of relating to conclusions you draw based on your data, not so much the data and their quality themselves. So also there we have more error sources to consider. Classically, you distinguish between internal validity, external validity, and as a sub-version of external validity, ecological validity that define the generalizability for quantitative data. But again, qualitative data are different. Qualitative data are usually not generalizable in the same way as quantitative data can be. So you can't say what I find is just generally representative of some underlying population, right? Because usually your case selection does not follow a procedure that would allow such microcosm conclusions. Like this result for this microcosm should generalize to the entire population. But there is just different kinds of statements and contributions you make in a qualitative study where the nature of the generalization is entirely different. For instance, qualitative studies usually point out that an interesting facet of a phenomenon hasn't yet been included in the conceptualization. And here, finding just one instance or a handful of instances may be sufficient to make the statement you want to make. Previous research has ignored this facet despite its existence or despite its importance. That's the second logic. If you say a pattern of behavior or thinking or an important typological subdivision hasn't been considered. Again, one case is enough to show that it exists, and a handful of cases may demonstrate that it's important enough that we should care and shouldn't ignore it. And however, statements about how typical and widespread a certain pattern is can't be accurately made based on qualitative data. You might get a rough feel as to what patterns are highly typical, highly widespread, and which are not. But this is then the purpose of quantitative research, to probe how frequent do we encounter that, how widespread is something. Okay, good. Good. But I'm not a big fan of these quantitative inspired quality criteria for qualitative research because it creates confusion with the terms, and these points out similarities that are, however, a bit vague. So I actually think it is good to use dedicated criteria for assessing the quality of qualitative research that you then again could subsume in the under these larger categories of validity, reliability, and generalizability, though I think it is quite rich to go through these one by one, though some of them overlap. So one thing that qualitative researchers should care about is the authenticity of their data. Is the analysis, the interpretation, and the presentation faithful to what the participants said or did? And you don't take it out of context and evoke misleading impressions, right? So you don't always have to portray the entire context if it's not misleading in some way, but if you need the context to understand what's going on, then it should be supplied. If the participants, let's assume the participants are sincere and want you to know the whole truth about what they meant with what they said or did, would they then subscribe to the presentation of their actions and statements? Would they say, on the conclusions you draw? Would they say, yeah, this is a fair and presentation of what I said and did? Credibility is similar, so you don't distort anything, and there can be high confidence in the truth of the findings. Transferability is then a concrete manifestation of this generalization idea. To what extent are the results and interpretations transferable to other contexts or other cases? Or inversely, how context specific are the findings that we have? If we find that a certain pattern of behavior exists in our sample, do we think this might exist somewhere else as well, or does it not? Should we generally consider this when we conceptualize the phenomenon, or is that a very special case? Dependability is then close to reliability. Stability and consistency of the results and their interpretation over time, even under varying conditions, and independent of the specific researcher or research group, right? But the varying conditions, that is of course a matter of degree. So we should of course look for stability and consistency in similar settings, and if we have strongly different settings, this might just be the different results for the different settings, and both are valuable contributions to the conceptualization of the phenomenon we want to investigate. Next criterion would be sincerity, and that is more about reflection about yourself and your own role in the research. The honesty and transparency of the researcher about their own biases, their own goals and challenges. Right? So being open and transparent about the research process and any difficulties you encountered. So that's different from authenticity, where it's more about what has been said or observed and whether that is portrayed in an authentic fashion. Here is what are our possible biases or goals. Confirmability would be the degree to which the findings are shaped by the respondents and not researcher bias, motivation, or interest. So this plays both to sincerity and authenticity, and would like the test for this could also be, would a different research group with different motives and different biases basically draw the same conclusions? And then we have some criteria that can stand in some tension with the previous ones, and that is more about the impact that your research makes on the audience. One would be resonance, so the degree to which the audience can comprehend and relate to the results, make sense of them, and reach meaningful insights. And since reality is often complicated, this may suggest you need to make some compromises in, for instance, the authenticity. So providing all the context might make things difficult, and you need to provide a lot of buts and howevers that reduce or threaten to reduce the resonance of your results. Also the meaningful coherence that you want, you would try to create an integrated, holistic narrative that reaches from research objectives to the conclusions you draw through the entire research project, that can motivate you to stay quiet about some of the complications and aberrations that occur during such a research process, and kind of smooth the entire experience in how you narrate it. And finally, the rich rigor. that the results and interpretations are saturated, well-founded on data, and well-related to theory, that sufficient data was collected, fieldwork was sufficiently long and intensive. So just to emphasize that one more time, there is a bit of tension between this narrative and impact-focused criteria and the data-basedness criteria, that narrating results in a compelling way sometimes may push scholars to take shortcuts and tone down complexities and aberrations. Okay. Qualitative research, despite being more flexible and freer, and also the kinds of conclusions drawn being of a different nature usually, there is also procedures for testing and ensuring high quality. One would be triangulation or cross-check. You collect data using various different methods or from various angles and see to what extent they converge or diverge in their interpretations. Another criterion borrowed from grounded theory is theoretical saturation. You monitor to what degree next cases that you add to your analysis really modify the preliminary conceptualizations and conclusions you've already been drawing, whether they add something new, lead to revisions, and so on. But as soon as you add a few cases and you realize, no, it's just more of the same, it's basically falling into the places already defined by the previous cases, then you've reached the point of theoretical saturation and can basically stop collecting more cases. A more systematic approach to quality testing is auditing. That means you create a high transparency documentation of your entire research project, the so-called audit trail. And that can be submitted to self-audit. So the researchers themselves create the audit trail and assess it for any stepping stones associated with it, any problems, or an external audit. The researcher's audit trail is checked by other researchers to create, or the other researchers even create the audit trail and observe you basically during the research process and assess the entire thing. And finally, the individual researcher is encouraged to engage in reflexivity. That researchers systematically include reflections about the nature and severity of their own biases, be that social background, political ideology, life experiences, or their own connections with their research topic, and how that influences the study, case selection, interview conduct, probing, and analysis, interpretation. And this then allows the readers to appraise the credibility of the research by themselves.